Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 118 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I'm your host, Neelan, and with me, as always, are my co-hosts, Mark and Callan.
Hey there.
May I just say that I've never seen you look so dashing.
Thank you. I've got my hair brushed for the occasion. I sort of pulled out all the stops to make this happen for your visual enjoyment, Callan. Yeah. This week on the Board Game Barrage podcast, we're going to be talking about games that are important, specifically games that have been important for the hobby in the last 10 years. What does that mean in the context of the hobby at large? What does an important game mean to us? How does it contribute to the hobby? And specifically recent developments, because, we could go back to time immemorial to talk about the foundations of the board game industry, but that's kind of not what we're talking about. We're going to sort of try look into the stuff that's been more integral in recent years. Like, what have been the more recent innovations that have...
Remember, kids, history is boring.
I thought you were going to say, like, history is a myth or something, and I was like... Hey.
History is written by the winners.
There's a lot of things we could teach the children. Right?
Yes, a lot of important rules about history.
That's in the Board Game Barrage for Kids episode.
That's just like our homeschool episodes on the side?
Right, exactly. Board Game Barrage for the tanklets.
See, tanklets, tankers, tankies, I just don't... What are they?
Tankletons.
Tanklets are little tanks. Tankies are...
Mark,
I think we're the tankies. Tankers, I think
we're the
listeners.
tanks.
Tank is our logo.
Yeah.
Oh,
we are
right.
the tanks, but what are the people who listen to the show?
I think you could call them the tankers. I don't think that's what we're going with.
No.
Okay.
Those are
Tankers
fatties.
come up a lot.
What? I'm serious.
What,
I wouldn't want to
tankers?
be a tanker. Yeah, what is that?
I mean, does it have
We
to
may
be that?
we may as well call them plump.
No, you're absolutely wrong. Tanker, like derogatory, you would call somebody a tanker who is...
I would
Tanker
curse
carries a lot.
at
That's
anyone who
strength.
called me a
It's-
tanker. If anyone calls me a tanker in person or online, I will curse at them.
Nobody
That
would
is
ever
a
call you a
that is
tanker,
a
though, because
promise.
that's not what
That's
people
a
call each
promise.
other.
That's a promise.
That's fine, but that's like if
Okay.
somebody calls me...
Do you believe that I'm
Beelzebub, I'm
a
gonna punch
trustworthy
them.
person?
What?
Am I a trustworthy person?
You are
Do
trustworthy.
I honor my word?
You do.
Never
lot of-
call me a tanker.
Okay, you got it.
We're going to be revisiting all of that later in the episode. Before we do that, let's talk about the games that we've been playing. Mark,
Yes.
what have you been playing?
So I got a chance to crack open a game that I've been searching for a while. I got the latest edition of it. This is Prêt-à-Porter, which means... What does it mean in French?
God,
Neelan?
Women's dresses.
Wrong. Neelan.
I actually have no idea.
Guess.
Oh, my
Dresses
God.
of
You're
women.
the French guy. Go ahead.
High fashion.
No, it means ready to wear.
Ready to wear.
RentTheRunway.com.
So, Prêt-à-Porter was a game that came out in 2010, speaking of our episode on games released since 2010. But the latest edition came out last year, I think. This was a Kickstarter edition, all souped up with a lot of new bits, a complete redoing of the art by Quanche Moria. The game, as the title sort of implies, has a fashion theme. You are running a fashion house, and you're designing clothes and putting them up in shows and selling them and building your fashion empire. This works out as sort of a worker placement game with a big engine building aspect to it. You place your workers out on a board in sort of dominant species style. The worker placement board, the actions fire off from upper left to bottom right. So you just go down the board taking your actions. The actions amount to different sections of the board. So one section is a place where you pick up buildings. One section you pick up designs. One section you pick up raw materials to make the dresses and the pants and the shirts and everything you're designing. There are 12 rounds, I believe. Every fourth round you put on a show, which is like one of the main scorings of the games. What you're basically doing is you're doing really a big engine building. You're adding buildings to your empire that allow you to make more dresses or get more positive press or make more trendy garments. You're hiring employees that make you more efficient and again allow you to get PR and be more successful in the shows. You can hire models to make those shows more profitable for you.
But this is all, like, lest we think that this is a thematic experience, this is a fairly dry-ish Euro game, right?
It is. I would say that it is helped quite a bit by its unique theme, and the art is very beneficial and very important to this game, because if this game was a more standard theme, it might suffer quite a bit, because I think in the end, while it is a very good worker placement game, well, a good to very good worker placement game, and scratches some heavy itches. If you're looking for a heavy game, this will probably do what you're looking for it to do, and it is pretty mathy as well. There's a lot of like calculations, so if you're looking for that, you're going to find it. But I think for the most part, it did feel pretty standard worker placement game to me. The art is great, but it's more of a case where like I just got the sense as I was like getting into it that this art and this theme is sort of saving it for me, or it's making this play of it better than it sort of should be. You know what I mean?
It's interesting because I don't know much about this, but I mean, I think the art and the theme is everything about the reason I want to play it. So hearing you say that the mechanics don't live up to that, would that be accurate? Or are they fine? Are they?
They're fine. That's
okay.
The thing.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's not a bad worker placement game. It is totally a fine worker placement game, but it is nothing mechanically special. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a person who can dive so much into the theme and appreciates really good artwork enough that that's enough for you, then you'll probably be fine. You'll probably really enjoy this game. But it was hard for me to appreciate it for more than just a veneer. I just couldn't get really, really into that aspect. I appreciated the art. I appreciated the theme. But in the end, it felt very standard worker placement to me. Again, fine. You know, the engine building does feel good. You do build a strong engine. It's definitely one of those games where you start off where like you feel like I can't do anything. I can't make a single dress. Mm-hmm. And in the end, you've got a whole line of dresses, and the scoring escalates, and you feel, even if you lose the game, you feel quite powerful at the end.
I mean, I think that you can't discount the idea that, hey, it's a normal, average worker placement game, but it has a super cool theme. You know, that's enough.
That's true.
It's better than a fantasy theme. It's better than a normal.
That's the power of
trading in the Mediterranean.
Right. I mean, that's the power of like what Wingspan had last year, right? Like right. It's a theme that is going to appeal to people that a lot of board games don't.
If this game didn't have the art and the theme, it would fall by the wayside, I think. I think it wouldn't have the cachet and the interest I think that it does. One thing I will focus on is, unlike Wingspan, it's not a mid-weight, I think, game. I wouldn't call it the heaviest game in the world, but it certainly is a little heavier than normal. So I don't think this is a game where, like, you know, a friend of yours is into fashion and you think, oh, this is going to be a good way to get him into playing this game, because I think it's too heavy for that. Okay. It's too heavy for a casual player to feel comfortable generally, playing it.
I have this idea that it would be fun to troll someone, okay? Which I always have that idea. And how you would do it is we would take a game like Kanban and a game like Prêt-à-Porter, and then we would re-theme them to each other, and then give it to like a Lacerda fan and hear them try to justify how the Kanban mechanisms actually live up to a fashion show in France. And they totally would try to do it. But you see what I'm saying? It's just like true dry Euros that pretend to have themes that they don't. Swippy-swappy them without them knowing. Wow.
It feels like you could actually do that for those two games, but I also think that Kanban is probably Lacerda's, in terms of the games that work with the theme. I think Kanban is relatively successful, but I take your point. I take your point.
Like a true troll, I have not played Kanban. So.
Or Prêt-à-Porter.
Yes, but I do want to play both, so fair enough.
And the thing is, like, I knew that you wanted to play Prêt-à-Porter, and I was excited when I got a chance to play it, thinking like, oh, if this works out, then Kellen is going to like it. Or, this would be a game that I'm excited to have Kellen play because I know he's interested. But I walked away from it thinking Kellen is probably not going to like this game. I mean, I think you're going to like it fine. I think this is a game where you would play it once and be satisfied.
Don't tell me what to like, sir.
Tanker.
Oh, don't you double cross me.
So that is Prêt-à-Porter by Ignacy Trzewiczek and Peter Haraskazak, which is exactly how Peter says his name, I'm sure. The other game that I played just now, actually, is Riff Raff. This is my copy of Riff Raff that I acquired.
Illegally.
I acquired from Kellen through a math trade a couple years ago.
You cheated me.
I cheated. You cheated yourself.
That was a 10 cow game.
That was a what game?
You won't get the reference. Never mind.
Okay. So this is a game that I've had after stealing it from Kellen for a while, but just now I got a chance to play it for the first time. Riff Raff is a dexterity game that has pretty crazy table appeal. You are building this swaying boat out of these little wood pieces, and it's quite high. I think it's probably about 2 feet tall from the bottom to the top of the mast. I think it's a mast, right? The mast is
yeah.
From the bottom of the box to the mast is about 2 feet. It has this
starboard to seabird.
Exactly.
Matey.
That's very nautical of you. And it's got this weight that anchors the mast that causes the boat to sway back and forth quite a bit. What you're doing in Riff Raff is you've got a bunch of wooden pieces that some of them look like little rats. Some of them look like sailors that sort of have their arms stuck out in a curve, and so you can sort of like hook them to the boat. You've got chests. You've got a bunch of different nautical shaped pieces. And the boat is broken up into 10 parts. 1 through 4 is on the base of the boat, and then the numbers increase as you go up the boat. So numbers 9 and 10 are at the very, very top of the boat, are on a plank at the very, very top of the boat. On your turn, everybody's going to select a card from their hand from 1 to 10. At the same time, everybody's going to flip the cards over, and then in descending order, people have to place one of their pieces onto the ship. So if somebody plays a 9 and I play a 2, they place their piece on the 9 part of the plank, and I place my piece on the 2, which is on the base of the ship. And then, as you might expect with this swaying boat and this being a dexterity game, pieces tend to fall off. If pieces fall off and you're able to catch them, then those pieces are out of the game. But any piece that falls off that you aren't able to catch, you acquire it, and now it's one of the pieces that you have to put up on the ship on a later turn. The goal of the game is to get rid of all your pieces. The way this boat sways back and forth with the, you're being very careful to place a piece on the boat, and then as soon as that piece falls, the counterbalance of the boat causes it to tip, and then you try to catch those pieces, and then it corrects itself the other way. You can sort of imagine it on this like crazy wave where it's going, the oscillation is increasing, and then all of a sudden like all the pieces are falling off, and you're flying across the table trying to catch these pieces to avoid having to add them to your side of the table. I don't think 2 players, which is the way I played it given the quarantine, is the ideal way to play, but I think I got a sense of it. Again, this is like a thing sort of like Prêt-à-Porter. If it wasn't for the table presence, I don't think this would be a game that I would be very much interested in. And truth be told, I don't know. I think this is the type of game where I'll play it once with everybody for the first.
Give it back, Neon.
Never. You can buy it. You can buy it
back.
That's always an option, Colin. Whenever you lose a game to me, you can buy it back at twice the price. That's a mark guarantee from me to you. But I think Riff Raff is the type of game that if I have people over who haven't played it, I will always be happy to break it out because it also plays pretty quickly. But the table presence is, pretty phenomenal. But I don't think I'll ever be itching to play it.
Yeah, this feels like in line with a lot of this style of gimmicky dexterity game where you feel like you get your full of it after a few games, and then the appeal is you want to show it to people after that. Yeah.
Right.
Because I think there are a few games that would pass the I need to show this to someone barrier more than Riff Raff does, because it's pretty novel in its mechanism.
Yeah, just the size of the boat and the way it sways around is really, really cool. There were some aspects of the gameplay and some strategy that I'd be interested in trying again, but it's not a game I'll be itching to break out. Again, unless people were coming over and I wanted to sort of wow them with the game fully built out.
I do think that your example is a little odd in comparing it directly to Prêt-à-Porter. I've described Riff Raff as an amazing mechanism in search of a better game.
Sure.
And Prêt-à-Porter, it's not the theme of Riff Raff or the table presence of Riff Raff. It's like the actual mechanism of the gravity and the way that the ball underneath pushes it and it moves like water. To me, that is pretty dang cool.
Yeah, I guess even with that mechanism, which is cool, that weighted ballast sort of like balancing and counterbalancing the movement, if it didn't have the table presence, but I guess you couldn't really get away from having a table presence with a mechanism like that. I just thought the size of it, and like it looks like a big boat with all these like parts sticking out, these like wooden parts sticking out. Without that, I thought it might not be something I'd even like. If it wasn't that size, even if it had that swingingness, that like at sea aspect to it where the weight sort of makes it go back and forth, but if it was smaller, like if it wasn't such a spectacle, I think I would be less inclined to even break it out with people for the first time. But I get your point. But yeah, again, it's like Prêt-à-Porter. It's a fine game, just not one that sort of blew me away or sort of met high expectations that I might have had for it.
I think the fortune cookie would read, the bigger it is, the more likely I am to break it out.
That is a classic Chinese proverb. So I'm glad
Probably might not make the cut, but I don't know. Mark, the secret is I just let the boat do the work. That's my secret, okay?
Right.
And it's clear that you don't know how to do that. I'm a sailor. I sail. I let the boat do the work. So
right.
I don't know what you did.
Use of the nautical terms earlier it made it clear that you were the sailor among us.
The seaboard side of the ship.
Mm-hmm. You're the seaman among us. So that is Riff Raff.
So I have been playing Scythe earlier today. So it's been a while since I played this, obviously because of quarantine. Tabletopia has a pretty good implementation of this. So I played this with a couple of work friends. We've played it a few times in the past. This game did not go so great. We had one in the group who sort of kind of struggled to sort of get out the gate, as it were. And one of the players...
Was that you?
It wasn't me. But one of the other players kind of just cleaned the floor with us, frankly. I do think that the more I play Scythe, one of the things that does become apparent, and this is a known problem of the game, is that faction board pairs are quite a big factor. Not unlike something like Tapestry, I think you can get quite got if you have a bad combination of a faction and a board. And this seemed to be the case for one of the players, certainly. So I don't know. Scythe is a game that I've played a lot of. It's one of my favorite games. But I'm finding games that sort of capture what I like about it in other ways and more interesting ways as I've played more. So I don't know. I feel like I might be playing less and less Scythe as time goes on. But that is all I have to say about Scythe for this week.
So had the other players played any games on Tabletopia before playing Scythe today?
You know what? They hadn't. But okay. I don't know. I don't think that really factors into it because they're both super video gamey folk. And right. they kind of took to it very, very quickly.
They know how to use a web browser.
Yeah, exactly. Even the things that would I think throw most people, like just navigating 3D space. I mean, they're like 3D artists, so they were like super at home in that interface.
So I'm curious, like how much do you think that affected the playtime? I'm just trying to get a grasp in general of how much playing a game on Tabletopia affects the playtime in general. That's just something I've been thinking about the last couple of days.
Well, you tell me. This game took 3 hours. Which is
long.
Very long.
How many players?
3 players.
I was hearing that you could bust through it even faster on some of these engines because Scythe has an app that I'll bet you would be faster. If you
exactly.
Were
I mean, I think if you were to play the actual digital implementation, I think it would be substantially faster. I think a lot of that is kind of your troubleshooting while you're doing, one of the players was having an issue where they were lagging out occasionally, so they would have to keep Xing and rejoining the game. So you're navigating a lot of little small things like that aren't just sitting down and playing a game. I don't know how much that contributes to the overall length, but it maybe just felt a little bit more deliberative. Everything just takes slightly longer, like literally dragging a card from across the table. So, I think it definitely pads out the game a fair bit.
I'm just thinking, do you think Tabletopia would ever make a game faster than playing in real life?
I think certainly
set up and tear down.
Set
up
exactly.
and tear. Yeah. So I mean, I'm just trying to figure out. I don't know. I'm just thinking about in general, does Tabletopia add or reduce game times? I guess it's obviously going to be a game by game situation, but I'm just generally curious about that.
The other thing that was a part of this was that it had been one player a long time since they had played it last, so there was a little bit of getting back up to speed with the game itself as well. I think that if you were all intimately familiar with the game and had played it on Tabletopia before, you could probably get comparable or quicker.
Yeah. Okay. Just curious.
But what if someone was a Scythe expert but didn't know how to use a web browser?
Then that might be substantially longer.
Good point.
I also finished up the Cosmos adventure game, The Dungeon. So I mentioned this last week as something I had started. There are 3 chapters in this game, and I had done the first chapter last week, and now I've completed the last two. The way that the adventure games work, and this is like Cosmos's Exit series, this is, I believe, a rule set that they're going to be doing a bunch of different new versions of. There are about 2 or 3 that are available right now. I forget the exact number, and I assume that they're going to be making more of them because it's a pretty versatile system. The way that this works is that it's attempting to recreate a point-and-click adventure game, but one that you would play with multiple people. So if I'm playing, say, a 3-player game, I would pick a character, and that would either be like the strength character, the knowledge character, the skill character, and they don't actually have stats, but they just have traits that are recognized throughout the game. We all start in a room. In the case of the dungeon, you're all starting in a prison cell. The way that the system works is that there are a bunch of locations, and each location has a 3-digit number in various spots. So there might be a 3-digit number on the door, there might be one on the bed, one on the window. And you also collect cards over the course of the game. So one of the actions you can do is just investigate a location, in which case you just turn to that 3-digit number in the little adventure book. You read out a paragraph, there's a little bit of story there, and it might say, take adventure card 50. This might be an item. That item also has a number associated with it. So now you can use items. You can combine that item with another location on the board. So if you, say, had a key and a lock, you would take the 2 numbers, put them together, and then read that entry of the adventure book. And either that will give you something else, some new location, some new item, or that entry doesn't exist and nothing happens. You can also combine 2 items together. So you might take, I don't know, a fishing hook and a line and put their numbers together, read them the entry, and you'll say, okay, throw away those 2 items, you now have a fishing rod. So there are clever little creative leaps of logic you have to make in order to advance in the game. And this is going to sound very familiar if you've played a point-and-click adventure game. So it's about finding items, combining them with the environment in order to progress. You keep moving through different locations until you've completed basically your objective, which I don't want to spoil too much about what you're trying to do in the specific game, because I think that's part of the joy of the discovery of it. But it's got a lot of little role-playing game trappings to it. What I mean by that is that there are times where the choices you make earlier on in a chapter might have an influence later on in the chapter. You might get specific interactions with the environment or with items that some characters, like the skill character or the knowledge character, are better at than others. All of this is sort of also influencing your score at the end of the game, because that's based on each character has a little bit of health, and some things have bad things that hurt your health, some things will renew your health. So there's like fun little systems in there. I don't think it feels substantially more involved than these sort of game books I sort of grew up playing. It does feel a lot like a choose-your-own-adventure book, specifically because the large part of your interaction is just flicking between different paragraphs of this book. I think having the visual layout of the locations and the cards is interesting and novel, and I think you could probably have a lot of fun with it. It hasn't really struck my fancy, though, in the same way. I don't think I'm going to be actively seeking out more of these. Part of that might be because as a solo experience, it obviously loses something versus like being able to discuss and talk about this with another person. But yeah, I'm not sure that I love it.
Have you played the Unlock escape room game?
I have, actually, and this is actually pretty reminiscent of that. Like, I think if I was describing the systems and you played Unlock, it's going to sound pretty familiar. Unlock gets a lot of mileage out of just being a deck of cards, basically. This has... it's a slightly bigger box, I think, than your average Unlock game, and the locations form like this sort of tableau of like one room connecting to another room, connecting to another room, which is a cool visual, especially by the time you get to like the 3rd chapter. You just have this massive map, but you're not frequently going back to ones that you've like fully explored, so it does feel a little bit arbitrary after a point. I did like this more than Unlock, I think it's fair to say, but as someone that was expecting this to be more like Cosmos's Exit games, it doesn't have that degree of like ingenuity and like puzzle solving to it. It felt a little bit, and again, this will sound familiar if you've played the video games it's trying to model, it's an awful lot of using everything on everything until you get the results that you're looking for.
What is the timer in this game?
It's not that bad.
No, I mean, in terms of timer, is there a timer?
Oh, no. So this is actually one of the interesting things, that there isn't. So unlike something like Time Stories, where every action is, using a finite amount of time you have at your disposal,
right.
This doesn't limit you from just doing everything, which I think in some ways is its biggest fault, because you just see all the wealth of options in front of you and you kind of just want to see all of them. So you just try all of them. And, the game punishes you a little bit by sort of having some of those actions be bad for you, but it just feels like that's not that big a deterrent. I wish it leaned more into making those choices sort of more meaningful. Like if you went down a bad path, that it would, pay off in some way.
Which is sort of like what you're forced to do in the exit games, because usually you have like a 60-minute timer or some like hard time, so you have to sacrifice being able to see the entire game for finishing it successfully.
And that's kind of the thing that Time Stories does quite well, I would think, as well, in that you kind of feel like, okay, no, what is the optimal path that I can do here, because I don't have the time to spare, basically.
I think the one pushback I would have, not that I've played this, is the idea that there are meaningful choices that affect the story. I don't know that I've seen any good examples of that in board gaming, or very many good examples in video gaming either. It's one of those promises that doesn't deliver, and there's like weird variants of the same thing where here's the evil path and here's the good path, and they're kind of 99% the same thing.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't even be expecting that, to be honest, but I would expect at least some sort of gameplay implications for some of the choices you made. Like having paths cut off, I'm not sure. I mean, I think you would have to design a lot of extra space at the edges to make that work, and this does feel like it's designed to allow you to completely explore the space, which isn't a bad thing. But it does remind me of how I used to play Choose Your Own Adventures, which was like, if I ever did the bad choice, I would flick back to the paragraph and just until I'd like literally tree search the entire book. I don't know if that's what they were hoping for, but that does feel like that sometimes. That is Cosmos Adventure Games. This is specifically the dungeon version. One quick thing about that, actually, I think this is about the most generic theme you could ever come up with for anything. It's like literally a medieval dungeon. I mean, just be more inventive, guys. Like there's a whole host of stuff at your disposal. It's kind of like reminds me how Time Story's first episode was an asylum, and they were like, yeah.
I mean, in their defense, though, the other theme is Monochrome Inc., which is a corporate company.
Yeah, that does actually sound more interesting.
Yeah, and so there were two that they sent us as review copies, and I gave you the one.
Which one did you give me?
I gave you the dungeon one, and I kept Monochrome Inc.
Perfect, thank you. That is Cosmos Adventure Games. Kellen, what have you been playing?
Nothing. It's a quarantine, bro. Stay safe. I'm remiss to not mention Mark's virtual birthday party that we had yesterday. Or the
most real virtual party ever.
Where we played great classics like Can't Stop and Perudo, Liar's Dice, and a bunch of Jackbox games. My God, who plays the Jackbox? Okay, there are some good games in there, but the narrator's voice?
Yeah.
I was dying.
Well, specifically, you don't know Jack. Like, base quiz mode is awful.
He's... Jack, I don't want to know him. He's very loud. He's a loud man. But thank you all who came out to that. It was super fun.
Yeah.
I guess maybe Mark should be thanking you, but I'll be the gentleman.
You can thank them on my behalf.
Yeah. Not a lot of gaming happening in my house, but we have been playing Innovation a lot online. There's a great Board Game Arena implementation, so you can be playing it asynchronously. So I thought that this would be a good time to introduce Christina the Blue Tank to the blue edition of Innovation, the expansion Innovation Echoes of the Past. And I think that we'll get her on to talk about her thoughts and feelings. We did just play one game, and she got rolled, first of all. So she was unhappy from like minute 7 or minute 5. Some of the tricks that you use to catch up in a base game of Innovation are trying to skip through the ages, but it's a little harder to do when there's an entire new set of cards. So Innovation Base has over 100 cards. Innovation Blue has 100 cards. You only draw a card if you don't have any blue cards in your hand. And so you're not going to see most of these expansion cards in any game. I've seen such a small fraction of these cards. And they add some interesting, unique mechanisms. They are totally unneeded, but I thought, well, I've played 5 games of it this week, so now is the perfect time to try them. There are a couple of them that I dislike and a couple of them that I like. The one I dislike is around foreshadowing, which is about setting cards up for future turns that is kind of annoying. There's another one that puts scored points directly on the cards, and so all of your scored points add with the cards in your score pile to score, and I think that that's smart. And there's ones that add mini actions to where the icons go. So if you have a set of splayed cards, you might actually get to do mini action, mini action, mini action, main action. And that's a ton of fun to set up a cool combo. So Innovation Echoes of the Past, I mean, really, if you've played enough Innovation to need it, it's good, definitely not essential, and frustrated Christina to no end. Wow. That is all I've been playing.
So before we move on to our feature topic, I just want to mention the Golden Geek Awards again. So this is Board Game Geek's Best of 2019 for board games, and one of the categories was for Best Podcast. And we've had a good response in the first week to getting the call out for nominations. And so first I want to just thank everyone. I think the response has been awesome. It's been great to seeing people show their support for the show by voting to nominate us. There is still another couple of days to get nominations in. So if you can do that at the time you hear this, please, and that nomination list is still up, we would hugely appreciate that. Like we said last week, we've been following the Golden Geek Awards for such a long time, and it would be such a huge honor to be nominated.
And that is at boardgamebarrage.com/vote. And you actually do need a certain amount of Geek Gold on Board Game Geek to vote. So if you don't see that voting page, feel free to email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com or reach out on the Discord, and we'll make sure that you get the right amount of Geek Gold so that you can vote.
Let's get into our feature topic.
Digital.
Wait, digital?
That was a couple of weeks ago.
This week, we are talking about important board games. Games that have significantly changed the way that we think about the hobby in significant ways.
Change the landscape.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to be talking about what importance means to us in the context of the hobby. And then maybe just, throw out some examples of some games in the last 10 years that we think have, changed, like as Mark says, changed the landscape of the hobby. So who wants to kick us off with some quick thoughts on what importance means to you? Kellen, what makes an important board game?
I think one of the most interesting things to me to talk about here is legacy and what games inspire other games. And so in some respects, it's hard to have a concrete conversation where we say, here are the 7 most important board games of the last 10 years, when it hasn't necessarily been borne out what board games have sort of inspired fads that have gone away, and what is the staying power of some of these trends. For example, I imagine that one of the two of you will have some legacy style games on your list, and I am a little bit of the belief that hasn't been borne out in terms of the actual amount of people playing these games, the amount of them that they're in the market. We could count, there's probably less than 30 of them that have been released, and so is it fair to say, obviously it's important on some level, and there's been some smashingly successful legacy games, and that's just one small example, but I think when I think of important, I think of things that may eventually end up being in essays or in critique pieces about the industry 50 years from now when it's all collapsed and all the money has gone to Kickstarter.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when it came to trying to decide what I thought were important games in the last decade, I thought of games where when I played them the first time, I thought, wow, I haven't seen this. And then I started seeing that. That was pretty much, if I sort of boiled down the games that are on my list to a single sentence, it'd be that. It'd be like games that surprised me, and then I saw their echoes in games in the future.
One of the things that was sort of hard for me to gauge, because I think that what you're both describing, this idea of games having a lasting effect, like as Kellen said, a legacy, one of the things that makes this hard to gauge is, so for example, I had thought about the early games that sort of followed on from deck building is something we spoke about last week, and games that sort of had deck building as a mechanic, and whether those actually influenced a bunch of other games to then have deck building mechanics in them. Because it's tempting to say that obviously the go-to example here is Dominion, which doesn't fall into our time window. But then the early games that started to integrate deck building as a mechanic, stuff like Mage Knight and Tyrants of the Underdark, like I don't see those as like core games that necessarily influence the rest of the hobby the same way that Dominion might. So it kind of becomes this interesting discussion of what were the actual influential games in that through line, right? And that was one of the things I sort of found hard to pin down. But for me, I think it largely falls into the same camp of what are the ongoing like ramifications in terms of number of games and influence to design, where you sort of saw something and thought, oh, this is really going to change the way that people design board games and play board games from here and out for, the rest of the decade or for the next who knows how many years.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to do two things here. And one, I think you're right to hit on kind of the sales metric even as being a potential part of this discussion, because we can all sit here and argue about which drafting game came first. Fairy Tale came out in Japan more years before Seven Wonders did, and Ergo, but if you look at sales to date, Seven Wonders has sold hundreds of thousands of copies more. And so when we talk about important or influential, if we're using those as synonyms, you'd have to give that nod to Seven Wonders over Fairy Tale in most cases, unless we could prove some sort of causal link that directly inspired the designer who designed Seven Wonders. And then the other side of that equation is that we also need to be limiting our scope in such a way that we aren't necessarily talking about the board game market at large, unless we're going to spend 30 minutes talking about Cards Against Humanity. Right? Because I don't give a flying about Cards Against Humanity or how that's inspired modern board gaming. Like, it's literally irrelevant to my life, except that we get 17 emails a week about reviewing adult party games that we don't want to play.
Yeah, right.
So when we have this discussion, we're having it from the framework of a very tight, focused, modern board gamer, the people who are playing designer, hobbyist board games, and not necessarily at large the board gaming space, because otherwise this is a boring conversation.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely valid. Because I think that all of this has to, in the same way that we talk about the importance of legacy in our top 50 list, there's a huge personal contribution that has to be a factor into this, which is not specifically like, which games have influenced sales in the largest sense, but which games have influenced the hobbies in ways that we deem important, if that makes sense.
We being the arbiters of
exactly,
taste
the
and
opposite
good judgment.
So on that vein, one of the things I sort of wanted to mention, and we've covered both of these a little bit briefly, but I think Kellen's point was exactly right, where what I was trying to think about the genesis of legacy as a genre, which is something that has meant a lot to me personally, and these sort of ongoing campaign games that change a lot over time. It's tempting to look at Risk Legacy as being like the one that kicks it off, but like to my mind, you have to take one step forward to Pandemic Legacy, which felt like where this really sort of kicked into, not necessarily in the mainstream, but in a way that sort of massively hit sales. And, Pandemic Legacy jumped to the top of BGG within a short amount of time.
That was huge.
And that felt like, even though it wasn't the first game to do it, and, Risk Legacy almost certainly isn't either, but Pandemic Legacy felt like the first time that Legacy became like, oh my God, this is a huge thing that's going to take off and become big. And like Kellen said, whether or not it actually sort of necessarily equates in terms of games and, overall sales, I think it's hard to argue that stuff like Gloomhaven follows on pretty naturally from that.
I mean, I still remember when Pandemic Legacy took over from Twilight Struggle for number one on BGG. I mean, you can argue how important a game being number one on BGG is, but it is a milestone. I mean, Twilight Struggle had been...
Risk Legacy came out 4 years in 2011 before Pandemic Legacy Season 1 in 2015.
But Risk Legacy was never number one on BGG. And I still remember the day, as nerdy as this is, I still remember the day that I woke up and found out that Pandemic Legacy had taken over Twilight Struggle. After
Where were you?
I was at home. I woke up and I saw the news. Saw the news.
You cried.
On CNN.
I think I immediately shared it on Facebook to like the interest of nobody that was my friend on Facebook. But
17 friends.
Yeah, exactly. One of them being like a board game fan at the time. But yeah, I do remember that. And that was a marker in BGG history, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said here for fighting for the trends that you care about.
Yeah.
And so I do not want a world where every game has a legacy system, and you can look at, even Mr. Pfister's newest game, Maracaibo, which is a dry Euro affair that has a legacy campaign to it. And, whether or not people are playing that, it's still percolating in the minds of these designers, whereas I would prefer tighter, more balanced, well-tested games to that type of system. And so what I want to manifest into the world is not to head down this path.
And I had a great time with Pandemic Legacy. I had a great time playing it, and that made me really interested. I remember one of our first episodes of Board Game Barrage, we were talking about Charterstone and the wave of legacy games, and I said that like even though Charterstone wasn't the best, I still was sort of excited about what Legacy had to offer, and I've since completely soured on that. A Legacy game now starts me off on the wrong foot. Just hearing a game is Legacy is something that is a negative for me now, but I still had a great time with Pandemic Legacy Season 1, and and still thought that was a great experience.
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to be the contrarian here as someone that's still sort of chasing the dragon on Legacy a little bit. Like, I still get excited about games that sort of have these big ongoing campaigns. And even if they're not necessarily...
Nuh-uh.
What's that?
Nuh-uh.
I don't. I definitely do. There are a bunch of these games that sort of like that show up on Kickstarter every now and again, and that is still something that sort of has this appeal to me. The idea of this having this like evolving campaign is something that I think, you know, the seeds were planted way back then, and I'm still... I don't think that I have the same reaction that they've failed to deliver on it, but it's still intriguing to me. It's still something I want in my games.
A game that I had on my list was Kemet.
Yeah, I have it on
Kemet
mine as
was
well.
one of the first games that made fighting something that was really rewarded. It sort of disincentivized turtling because the only way you could score points in a fight was being the aggressor. And I remember it opening my eyes to just how much it threw you into fights and made you, it's just very hard to hide in Kemet. And I remember playing that and just really liking it. Like, okay, I can be aggressive. I'm not going to be punished for taking a chance and like taking it to my opponent. Before that, too many games that I'd played rewarded people who played conservatively and made taking those big swings a clearly bad strategy to follow. And I liked Kemet forcing interaction in that vein. And I think a game that is not on my list only because I haven't played it is Chaos in the Old World, because Blood Rage is another game that I have on my list because of the combat not being a terrible thing to initiate. And I remember playing Blood Rage for the first time, and I just loved how it made attacking feel fun. Even if you lost, guys, you'd be okay. It's not like if you lost like a battle or two, you'd be out of it and you'd feel really, really bad. It just made fighting fun.
It's tough because Chaos in the Old World is a 2009 release, so disqualifying it from the window of our conversation, and why I wouldn't have Kemet on the list. I think that's an interesting idea of rewarding aggression. And, you know, we could play the game, but what about this game in 2007? Or what about this game in 2005? And so that's not really helpful. And I think Kemet itself at least has inspired, you know, the series that is Cyclades, that is Inish. So there's coolness even built in right there.
Kemet feels to me, at least, at the point that I came into the hobby, as like one of the early hybrid games of Euro and Ameritrash sensibility. So a game that sort of looked like an Ameritrash game of just having minis and big monsters, but has a more Euro underlying core to it. And that felt to me like the big kickoff of a lot of games that would have come later. Stuff like Blood Rage, as Mark already mentioned, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, just given Chaos in the Old World as sort of being the modern precursor to a lot of these games like Cthulhu Wars very directly. And like a lot of Eric Lang's other games like Blood Rage and Rising Sun. I'm surprised you haven't played it, actually, and I would probably personally cite Chaos in the Old World over Kemet, but I mean, I understand what you're saying.
That's actually interesting, and I think it's worth pointing out that like Chaos in the Old World, to my knowledge, sort of came and went even before I was, and by that I mean came and went out of print, like before I was even playing board games regularly. So yeah, maybe that's just an omission on my part.
I think that we can't talk about the 2010s and importance without talking about Kickstarter. I'd obviously love to give this to a good game like Blood Rage for sort of breaking Kickstarter, but it was a earlier game from Cool Mini or Not, which was Zombicide, that I think probably gets the nod here for raising so much money and sort of opening the doors. I think a lot of people cite Alien Frontiers, if I'm not mistaken, from Game Salute as one of the first, if not the first big Kickstarter project for board games, but I think Zombicide took that model, applied it to miniatures, and really took it home. And I think that model is still being used today by companies like Awaken Realms that are hitting in two different genres of players. You know, they're selling you Nemesis, which people will buy just to paint the miniatures. And then there are people who are board gamers who are buying it just to play the game. And that is doubling and tripling and quadrupling their profits online. And Kickstarter is here to stay with board games for the foreseeable future, even as the people who made it big, Cool Mini or Not, are sort of in a very public way being like looked at and audited and saying, like, is this business model right or sustainable? Mark, no objections? You usually object to what I say. So
That's true. That's true.
You don't have an objection?
It's hard for me to object.
Thorough.
I have to admit, like, I was sort of late to the Kickstarter game. I remember Alien Frontiers for sure, being the game that opened people's eyes to the possibility of Kickstarter being a board gaming thing. But by the time the ball started rolling on board games and Kickstarter, I was sort of out of it. And I remember hearing about Zombicide and how big it was, but I wasn't really like in touch with board gaming on Kickstarter at the time. But yeah, it certainly opened the floodgates that had been cracked open by Alien Frontiers.
Codenames is in this conversation, right? Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah, I would say it's probably the number one.
Totally.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
I think there are very few games that have sort of entered the scene and have had as much wide adoption as Codenames has. And this is a game that, it comes from a publisher and a designer who, has a huge reputation in the industry, but then sort of broke out of, sort of Vlad Kvártel has a pretty specific niche in the hobbies as these sort of intricate, heavier games. And then he comes up with Codenames, and it's like simplicity itself, and it has such broad appeal, and it's so inventive for its simplicity that you can sort of teach it to anyone and they could have a great time with it. Codenames is kind of incredible, and I think that you only have to look at the many, many spin-offs and talk to almost anyone that sort of interacts with board games in some capacity to discover that they've probably heard of it. They've probably played it. And if that's not influence, if that's not importance, then I don't know what is.
It's funny to talk about this because you can directly look at all the word games that have come over the past few years and attribute them to Codenames' success. All the publishers are sort of chasing Letter Jam. There's just so many other of these. Decrypto. How am I struggling with these? Because so many of them have come out, but it's like, was it a new gameplay innovation, or was it just, oh wow, they made money with 50 words on cards,
right?
And $2 worth of components. And I think it was probably the latter rather than the former.
I'd agree with that.
But I think that Codenames also leaned into, in my mind, one of the trends of the 10-year span, which is sort of the limited communication model of doing co-op and competitive games. And so you see Hanabi earlier in the 2000s kind of helping kick off that sort of limited information co-op thing. And then we still see that today with games like The Crew, being all about how you communicate when you're restricted in what you're able to communicate. And we've seen so many amazing games over the years utilize this: The Game, The Mind, The Crew, Decrypto, Codenames. And so to me, it's sort of signpost from a mechanisms perspective is the fact that, well, the way in which you give clues are, you get one word and a number, and like that's the clue, and that's the simplicity of it. That's the puzzle. And but just from a mass market penetration, Codenames has clearly been the biggest thing from the hobbyist market to make its way into mass.
Yeah, absolutely. Another game on my list is the game that everybody's trying to kill. This is Splendor, with all the Splendor killers out there. There have been middle light games around for a long time, but Splendor has a staying power and an appeal that I don't think many games in that weight sort of match. And I feel like games like Azul, Sagrada feel like descendants of Splendor, or the next step from Splendor. Games that feel like, in their abstraction, and they all have some sort of theme, but in their abstraction, they are games that can appeal to anyone, sort of. There's a game that you feel like you can, maybe it's not the first game that you teach a non-gamer, but it's the second game, And again, games like Azul and Sagrada, they're these abstracts that have some draw in their components or their artwork that make it appealing for people who, again, may not be interested in gaming in general. The classic thing with Splendor were the poker chips. Everybody was talking about the weight of the poker chips and how nice it was to have the poker chips. And that was something. I mean, enough people are talking about it that there's something to that. And then you see that, down the road with Azul and games like that, where you've got the clanking of the pieces in Azul, the tile pieces. So, yeah, and there's the smoothness of the gameplay. Smoothness of the gameplay with Splendor. Again, with Sagrada and Azul, these are games that have light rule sets, abstract, so you're not stuck to a theme that people may not like, and just run. There's a lot of little dopamine hits as you're building your engine. It's a game that has a small rule set, but you get these little okay, now my engine's a little stronger, and my engine's a little stronger, and before somebody runs away with it, or before you're if somebody gets too strong or somebody's way behind, the game ends. It's a short time frame. So it's just a very pleasant game. And I think it led to other pleasant games that, and pleasant is often a derogatory term, but I think with Splendor and Azul and games like that, they're boons to the hobby. They're things that help our hobby out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for the high production values, the themed abstract, as you put it, as just being like this step up from the sort of abstract games that we'd had in the hobby up until that point, as seeming more like dry and plasticky.
Yeah.
I've been meaning to scream Century Spice Road this entire segment as you've listed out the examples.
Yeah. The most Splendor-esque game of all Splendor-esque games, Century Spice Road.
And it's also never been killed, so, it's going to be around forever. Right.
You can't kill it. He's always on the run.
You come at the king, you best not miss.
Mr. Splendor. The last one that I wanted to talk about was Scythe. And this is a bit of an unformed thought, which is why I'm sharing it with you live on the Board Game Barrage podcast. But I think that what Stonemaier Games is doing and has done with Tapestry and Scythe specifically is something that I feel like I'm seeing in the video game space a lot, which is in the past we had the JRPG with 1,000 interconnected subsystems, and you could dive in and look under the hood at what those subsystems were and goof around with each of them to min-max the hell out of your stats. And where we are now with the modern video game is that all of those subsystems still exist. You're just not exposed to them. And this is obviously broad strokes generality. So what I think about Scythe is that Scythe has taken what could be a min-max efficiency puzzle and packaged it in such a way that you don't even realize that it's there. The engine exists underneath the gameplay to the point that Scythe has become almost a mass market success. This is a game that I've heard my video game friends who don't play board games bring up in casual conversation. My friends got me Scythe for Christmas, and oh my God, have you played this? I've played it 100 times now. And I really think that there is this almost Disney-like sense to what Stonemaier Games is doing and will continue to do. And I think I'm seeing other publishers attempt this model where the production value is insanely high. Everything is perfect and in its place. And some of the more Euro-like games where you can see the 7 different mechanisms and how they all interact and learn about the subsystems and geek out and nerd about it. Like, that isn't the point of a Stonemaier production game. It's an experience. I'm having a hard time articulating what this is, but I do feel like it is where we are going in some sense with modern Euro games.
It's sort of, would you call it like sort of the Apple sort of thing where it's like, it's not so much about fiddling with the knobs and stuff. It's just like a prepackaged experience that is being sold.
Yeah, that's quite good. And so this isn't a knock on Scythe. I know Neelan's grimacing and waiting for like where the shoe is going to drop. No, but did you understand?
No, I think everything you're describing is the reasons I've championed Scythe in the past. Like I've described Scythe as having one of the best interfaces to a game, and I think that's exactly what you're trying to say. It's like by having a good interface, it's hiding the systems in a way that feels fun and interactive, whereas it's not necessarily.
Oh, don't you use the word interactive?
but that's kind of my point. It's not necessarily that when you dig deep into it. I mean interactive in like in the physical sense, as in you move this piece from this inset to this inset, and that's an upgrade. Like those little pieces of actual physical interaction make the game more appealing to the average board gamer.
Yeah, it's hard for me to find or cite examples of what this has directly inspired beyond Tapestry, but I do know that Scythe is an important game of the last 10 years, and I think that will be proven out on a 20-year time horizon. I've got a fire truck. I live... if the rent is cheaper near the firehouse, there's a reason for that.
There you go.
It's because you get to hear this.
Yeah, I think that's going to close us out. There's, one more sort of branch of games I don't think we really have time to get into is kind of these puzzle type games in the realm of Time Stories, Exit, Unlock. I feel like those have been a big thing, like the escape room style of game. I feel like a lot of those have like spun off in the last 10 years. And there are a lot of them, and I think they have a lot of broad appeal. I don't know if I could point to one specifically as like the progenitor, but yeah. That feels like a big
Time Story.
Maybe Time Stories is it. But that feels like that's been a big hit in the hobby recently. I think that is going to do it, though, for our topic on important and influential games. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. You can catch us on all of our social media. If you want to reach out to us, that is on Twitter, that's on Facebook, that's on Instagram. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. Come chat to us on Discord. We're playing digital games that are spinning off in the channels every so often. So come join us on Discord to come chat with us, play games with us. It's a great way just to talk with fellow board gamers in the hobby about the podcast and a whole host of other stuff as well. That's at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Thank you as always to Heart Society for our intro and outro music, What's on Your Mind Kid, from their album Wake the Queens. Goodbye, everybody.
See ya.
Stay safe.
So long.
Hello.
These
There we go.
headphones make me look like an alien.
That's not the
They're like
headphone.
triangular. Well, I mean, I do have a long head. You stupid meanie.
Wait, because like the way that they're angled.
They're like conically triangulated like an alien.
Like an alien's ear does.
And it's not the haircut I gave myself in quarantine. How dare you? Right. Like, we don't want to blow our wad anyway on the good. But I got to
That
figure
we
out.
have saved up.
That's what I'm saying, yeah. The longer it goes, the more we have saved up.
That's right.
Do you
But
know
we're
what I
not
mean?
saving anything is the problem.
And we're blowing it.
We have nothing to blow is my point. We have no wad to blow.
So specifically games that are important in the last 10 years. Oh my God, I have like a fly like literally right in my face. This is maddening.
Get him.
Get him. Get him. Get him.
It's
Come
keep
on, Elon.
flying out of sight.
Here, I'll
Anyway,
get him, Elon.
sorry about that.
How'd I do?
Great.
You missed.
This week on the Board Game Barrage podcast, we're going to be talking about games that are important, specifically games